Well, ladies and gentlemen, this very interesting turn for the day of politics. And before we get on to the main video of today, can I remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, click like, and share this video with your friends. So many of you have asked me the question as to whether the US ambassador to South Africa, that's Leo Brent III, would his credentials be accepted by the South African government? Well, the current news is that the credentials have been received by DIRCO officials. A formal presentation to Cyril Ramaphosa was pending. And at the time of recording, the ambassador's credentials have been accepted. Now, you'll know that the appointment came following a diplomatic freeze in relationships between Washington and Pretoria. Now, the US had previously moved to sideline South Africa during the G20 engagement. You remember that the America didn't actually come to South Africa. And South Africa was then excluded from the next G20 in America. At the moment, South Africa's had no current ambassador in Washington following the prior ambassador's expulsion, and South Africa was then hit with the 30% punitive tariffs. A big part of the punitive tariffs was obviously on South Africa's agricultural exports. If you've watched the news of recent, you'll know that Trump's tariffs were struck down in a court in America, and a court that Trump classed as being biased and going against the president and traitorous, the usual Trump rhetoric. Well, in response to that, Trump adopted a 15% global US tariff. Now, that global tariff will now apply on South Africa rather than 30% punitive tariffs. So South Africa's actually had some good news, I suppose. Now, the actual products that will be affected will be wine, table grapes, stone fruit, apple juice, soft citrus, because that's effectively what South Africa exports the most of. That's outside of obviously the automotive industry. We're going to get back to the automotive industry in a second. Now, those 30% tariffs had actually caused severe damage to the South African economy, specifically between trade between the US and South Africa. So the fact that they're now being reduced due to the Supreme Court ruling, which found that Trump lacked the authority for the original tariff mechanism, actually gives South African exporters a huge reprieve. Now, if you watch Morning Show, you'll know that AGOA was renewed, but that in itself didn't really have any formal impact on the South African exports to the US because of the punitive tariffs that were already in place. So all those tax benefits that we were due to get, well, didn't really get them. So we had this AGOA thing, but then we had the tariffs that overrode the benefits of AGOA. Now, South Africa's agricultural exports hit a record $15.1 billion last year. So we were expecting that to go down this year because of the American market, and it looks like, well, things are about to improve. Now, you may look at that and say, well, actually, that spells good news for South Africa. Now, it does say we get back to our vehicle manufacturing, and the news is that because of the punitive tariffs that was imposed on South Africa has now repositioned its automotive industry to export to other territories. Now, let's show you what that actually looks like. Well, vehicle imports to India increased by 60% year on year. Now, in contrast, Chinese imports to South Africa are actually up 25%. Now, logically, South Africa's exports to the US declined sharply after Trump imposed his punitive tariffs. Now, some of those vehicles have actually been redirected and shipped to the European Union. And one territory that's actually got a lot of South Africa's vehicles is Belgium, who's had a significant surge in import numbers from South African manufacturers. Now, Tata also came back to South Africa and re-entered the South African market via Motus. As you know, multiple Chinese brands have entered South Africa, with the South African government in talks with OEMs to expand local assembly. Please note the word I said there, assembly, that's not manufacture. Now, why am I saying all of this? Well, the South African market internally here would previously have made vehicles to export to the US and sell to the South African market. The selling of those vehicles has been redirected to India and the European Union, with an example given of Belgium. But the actual sale of those vehicles in our domestic market now appears to be shifting to Indian brands such as Tata and Chinese brands. So the actual automotive industry in South Africa now looks noticeably different because of Trump's punitive tariffs. Now, with those tariffs easing, the question then remains as to whether local manufacturing will redirect vehicles that may have been destined for the South African market and whether they'll be instead rerouted to the American markets. ultimately what that could mean is that if those vehicles are exported to America, our local vehicle prices to consumers, will probably increase through nothing more than supply and demand, which will push more of the South African market into the Chinese territory. Now, all of this is very, very interesting. And one reason that is really interesting is because the news came out that in terms of global, bilateral and regional trade agreements since April 2025, South Africa has had no major new reciprocal trade deals. Now, we obviously have our current trade deals with the EU, China, and the United States. We've already mentioned AGOA, but South Africa itself has actually fallen behind in terms of global trade deals and global competition, with many territories now choosing not to trade with South Africa itself. Now, the main reason for this is that South Africa's trade policy appears to be slow and fragmented, with the South African government not actually having a coherent plan in order to make South Africa globally competitive and in order to negotiate new deals with new trade parties. So when we come back to the auto manufacturing sector, a lot of what's happened here seems to have been renegotiated through the actual sector itself. A lot of it does not appear to be as a result of government intervention. So yes, the automotive industry is kind of saving itself. The government is not helping. And when you see overall in terms of the states itself, what we are noticing is that South Africa is becoming less competitive and less of a manufacturing destination for many countries. If you look at our competitiveness next to many of our competitors, we're just not that desirable. But there is some exceptions, and one of those exceptions is actually Walmart, a US company. Now, in terms of Walmart, Walmart has now opened its third South African brand store in Boksburg. I was quite surprised in Boksburg. Walmart in South Africa plans to open an additional 21 stores nationwide. Their expansion plan is going to focus on Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, and the Western Cape, with many game stores, historical game stores, having now been bought and being converted into Walmart-branded outlets. Now, Walmart is also looking to expand their online ordering and their express service, with 60-minute delivery rollouts being expanded to many of their stores. Now, if you know anything about Walmart, their big claim to fame is that they use large purchasing power in order to be price advantageous to the consumer, specifically on staple goods like bread and milk and butter and whatever else. Now, the expansion of this US firm in South Africa will drive pressure on many local retailers, and many stores are prepping for potential closures in their sector, with Walmart actually sweeping up much of the competition. But it's important to remember it's a US brand. So with that being said, you cannot underestimate the importance of the American market, no matter how much South Africa tries to redirect its trade. Now, as we're talking about America and Donald Trump, it would be wrong of us not to talk about the white unaliving claim. I can't use the G word because if I use the words white and the G word together, I get a big notice on my videos because of YouTube's AI algorithm. Anyway, 60 Minutes, CBS 60 Minutes came to South Africa to investigate the claims of the white unaliving claims in South Africa, specifically around farm violence, and they interviewed many farmers who apparently rejected the unaliving claims. But many individuals, having now watched the actual 60 Minutes documentary, have noticed that they came to South Africa with the express intention of rubbishing the claims made by Donald Trump. Instead, what they appear to have done is actually confirm that the claims made by Donald Trump were in fact true. That didn't really work out the way they wanted to. Now, they tried to dispute the claims of mass graves marked by crosses. Nobody ever said there were graves. They always said that they were an actual representation of what may have occurred in South Africa. And they did try and minimize the violence on many farmers, but it didn't really work out. In fact, you can watch highlights of that. Now, I'm going to show you the full highlights. It's a 3-minute clip, but really it's worthwhile watching. Have a watch.
In the rolling hills of KwaZulu-Natal province in the southeast of South Africa, we met Daryl Brown, a 7th-generation rancher and farmer.
Did you grow up knowing you would be a farmer?
It was always in my blood. It's a calling.
But that calling has often come with risks. 10 years ago, his 82-year-old father was brutally attacked on the farm by robbers looking for guns and money. Then, in 2020, Brown's friends, Glenn and Vida Rafferty, were murdered in a robbery on their farm nearby.
Your father was attacked. You've had friends murdered. Do you live in fear?
I certainly live carefully. We're aware of what's happening around us. We don't take silly chances.
We came to Darrell Brown's farm because of what President Trump said last May about the murders of South African farmers.
It's a genocide that's taking place that you people don't want to write about, but it's a terrible thing that's taking place, and farmers are being killed. They happen to be white.
9 days later, South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, came to the White House. Elon Musk, who was born in South Africa and has also made claims of genocide, was there too. What happened next seemed to take Ramaphosa by surprise.
Excuse me, turn the lights down.
President Trump showed several videos, proof, the White House said, of the violence targeting white farmers.
These are burial sites right here. Burial sites. Over 1,000 of white farmers.
We found the spot where those white crosses were once planted. It's a lonely, potholed road not far from Darrell Brown's ranch.
It definitely wasn't a burial site. I mean, those crosses were there for less than 48 hours. It was purely an avenue of crosses that we planted there in honor of commercial farmers in South Africa that had lost their lives.
Brown knows about the crosses because he put them there on the day of his friends Glenn and Vida Rafferty's funeral. He keeps them locked in a shed. In 2024, he brought them out again for the funeral of his best friend, Tolly Nell, who was also murdered on his farm. Tolly's wife, Renee, still lives there. Her husband was killed in front of her trying to fight off burglars. Her son, Tienes, was tied up while they stole cash and guns. No one has been arrested.
My whole life has changed. I've got nothing to look forward to. Sorry.
Tienes now runs the farm. He carries a weapon with him almost all the time.
The only time I don't have it on me is when I'm in the shower.
Really?
Because I don't ever want another situation to arise where I feel that I'm a victim.
The Nells have hired private security guards and fortified their property with electric fences and cameras. Many in South Africa feel they can't rely on the country's ineffective and overwhelmed police to keep them safe.
So on to a very final news story, and this is the news story, a much-loved topic of BEE. Well, the Trade Minister, Parks, has summoned many sector chartered councils with the specific goal of recreating a new B-BBEE scorecard, because according to him, compliance with the scorecards at the moment is nothing more than a tick box, and it's nothing more than just numbers on a sheet. And what they are is that they're disattached from real economic outcomes. So he says that he wants to focus a new BEE regime on ownership participation, supplier development, job creation, township and rural enterprises, and says that the current BEE reporting lacks any measurable impact. And that's because BEE in the country is nothing more than an enrichment scheme. We all know this. Now, many sector councils have been instructed to improve governance and data integrity so that they can collect greater data, which the government can then use in terms of their monitoring of the transformation outcomes with a view to amend BEE policy going forward. And okay, so that's the news of today. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And until next time, bye.